Hello, respected viewers. It being the 31st of October, it's John Keats's birthday. So John Keats would be 229 were he still alive today. He died at the age of only a quarter of a century. So as he would have said himself, the opening lines of Endymion, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness fadeth never. But what about John Keats? So, though he died at such a young age, he's one of the most celebrated poets in any language. So he's universally jubilated in English and in translation, a superlative syllable stringer, blessed with the most inappreciable literary gifts. But he was a man of many parts, what a real Renaissance man, a pharmacist. People prevailed upon him to study medicine, but he declined, even though being a physician would have given him financial security. He realized very early in life, age about 22, that his life was severely limited by tuberculosis, then an incurable disease. So he devoted his remaining time to the craft of poesy. And I think you'll concur that his effort was repaid a millionfold in the intense pleasure he's given countless people down the last 2 centuries, and no doubt shall continue to do so for centuries yet to come. Um, what is it about his oeuvre that accounts for this remarkable durability of his verses and their popularity in so many countries? Because I was introduced to his work as a schoolboy. I remember Monsieur Grenier, his article on it, and that's what really got me into Keats. As a schoolboy, I often saw these posters about Keats up in the English department, writing, "I think I should be remembered amongst the English poets after my death." It seemed like a very grand and fanciful hope as he was dying a penniless poet in Rome by the Spanish steps. But indeed, it came to pass. So my adulation for this spectacular poet has only grown over time. It seemed like his mind was teeming like a river full of silvery salmon leaping to the sunlight. So, where did he catch his inspiration from? I don't think he wrote one bad poem. Some of them may be merely satisfactory. So he symbolizes the Romantic movement better than anybody else. He almost personifies it. And so he died younger than any of the others apart from Thomas Chatterton. Chatterton probably foreshadowed the Romantics. So despite his life being all too brief and it being touched by pain and again, he has given joyance to many. So it was a very modern life, yet for him it was never despair. He sought solace and happiness in even the most mundane things. He had this incredible knack of turning something unremarkable into something unutterably splendiferous. So he had a sublime intellect, and that's thrilled so many people for the last 200 years. He refined his sentimentality and his imagination and able to compose some of these exquisite and artful poems. There were panegyrics to nature, and this has never been surpassed. So that's why his name is illumined in perpetual glory. So by the ages of 20, both his parents had died. Well, his father died when John Keats was very young, his mother when he was 19, one of his younger brothers already. And as I say, John himself was terminally ill in his early 20s. So it appeared to be a life swathed in the deepest sable. Therefore, he knew the time was very short indeed. Vita brevis, ars longa. And that's how he's immortalized himself through composing so many magnificent verses. He just suffered all these bitter blows from fate, but he was ever upbeat and resilient. And as I say, he was intensely conscious of his mortality, and that made him all the more productive. He seemed never to squander a single second. So his verse is a palimpsest of classical education, overlaid with these tropes of the Romantic movement. And there's this almost childlike sincerity that shines through these many masterful verses. The lucidity and the originality of his work has few peers. So if you read them, perhaps you'll be possessed by the blithe spirit which he mentioned. He limned that so much, and indeed that became the title of a novel by Evil and War. And as he says, that you will breathe serene if you read into his verses. So he was born near where the Barbican Tube Station now stands. There's a plaque where the building once was. So he spent all except half a year of his life in London. So his father ran a livery stables and an inn and was reasonably prosperous. John was one of four children to survive infancy. So his life was so often tinged with tristful tidings. The family was in straitened circumstance after his father's death. he had a bit of an education knocked into him, certainly quick at his books, and that's how he mastered Latin and ancient Greek. Their accidence was considered vital. So all this fructified in his ever fertile mind, and that's where he drank deep of the ancient Mediterranean cultures, which were the mainstay of education back then. So his schoolmasters were agog at his uncommon gifts, and he learnt the art of scansion, and he was word weaving for the rest of his life. So by his mid-teens, he was composing splendid and elegant poesy, but very few pieces of his juvenilia have survived. And as an adolescent, he was afflicted by anxieties deeper than most. Partly the familial financial situation was perennially insecure. Moreover, he was well below average height. His mother had rewed a second time, well, rewed, but the second marriage was cataclysmic. It was so bad that within a few weeks, she and Job's stepfather separated, they never divorced. Divorce was a very pricey and very lengthy prospect, considered absolutely ignominious for the sinned against as well as the sinning. Anyway, he had to care for his younger sister, his two little brothers, and despite these many bereavements, he didn't seem to dwell on the awful hand that life had dealt him. And his poetry is replete with vitality and buoyancy, which he needed to keep going. He so easily could have been dejected, but he didn't seem to regret his lot. I mean, I realized that being bereaved early in life was not uncommon back then as it is today. So more it should be more about his poetry. Yeah, and for him a lot of women were unapproachable. He was about 5'2", and he felt this smallness counted against him, as well as his fiscal challenges meant wasn't very alluring as a suitor. So he's apprenticed an apothecary, we now call that a pharmacist. He qualified in that profession. um, Anyway, so then he wrote his poems by John Keats, published when he was 18, I suppose because he didn't have to do A levels. He sold a few hundred copies. Remember, poetry was much more popular then than it is today, but then the population was much smaller. So a few hundred copies is very credible for a first publication, especially considering he had no literary connections. So as a literary debut, it was sans pareil. You know, he didn't come from the aristocracy. He hadn't attended one of the only two universities in England at the time. But so he was well on his way to achieving literary mastery. So he's smitten by his neighbor Fanny Brawn, but her family met his suit with disapprobation. He wasn't affluent. They thought he had no prospects. His future was bleak, and they did not want their daughter marrying beneath her station. So, like a romantic, that's why he derived happiness from very ordinary things. He rejoiced in plants and trees and valleys, the wind and wine. So many people would pass these things without a second glance, but not John Keats. So he drew solace for these unremarkable occurrences in the natural world. His life was grief laden and lovelorn, but he didn't write much about these heartrending themes. Some of it, so much of his verse could have been poignant, but he didn't write anything which was macabre. And his work is astonishingly free of plaintive verses. I suppose he had enough of that in real life. He didn't want to verse about it. But the epistolary evidence is of his vivacity and his upbeat character. He was no tragedian, though he easily could have been. Remember, the world was in turmoil as he rose to manhood. The Napoleonic Wars were being fought. France marched all the way across Europe and back again. France clubbed small nations insensible. From New Orleans to Nepal, the British Empire was engaged in dubious battle. There was radicalism in the air in the United Kingdom, but overseas, many battles, sieges, spoliations, and revolutions raging. Some preached revolution in the United Kingdom, and the reaction was hell bent on crushing the life out of radicali. There were some who were vindicators of the abolition of servitude. Britain was ruled by a totally insane monarch, George III, and his comically corpulent son, the Prince Regent. Now, all this passed Keats by. He seemed to be completely indifferent to politics. He just glazed over at the topic. So the world was in upheaval, but you wouldn't have guessed that by reading his verse. He wrote about other things. So by the age of 20, he was really making waves in literary London, and that's how he became known to Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Southey, Leigh Hunt, and others. Now, William Wordsworth was a generation older than them, but even Wordsworth was mightily impressed with Keats's work. Wordsworth had been a trailblazer of the Romantic movement, but by this time was beginning his cultural retreat. He was a father figure for some of them, but perhaps he was cold and distant as an 18th century father. But he didn't look askance at Keats because Keats had no flirtation with radicalism. So Greece was Keats's muse, and alas and alack, he never visited Hellas. The Napoleonic Wars and his chronic impecuniosity precluded that trip to the cradle of civilization. So 1818, that was really the annus mirabilis for him, a very fruitful year, and that's what built his reputation. What spurred him to be so incredibly productive? It may have been him being diagnosed with this deadly disease. He was very cognizant of mortality. That year, his brother had died of tuberculosis, his brother being only 19. That was a shot across John Keats's bowels, and he coughed up dark blood that year. He'd studied materia medica. He knew it was arterial blood, and his days were numbered. The cold and silent grave was eagerly awaiting him, so he felt obliged to leave something to posterity. And from that moment, his feathered quill was seldom still. He resided by Hampstead Heath, and that's where he composed 5 of his 6 odes. And his reputation is really staked on his odes. And the house is owned by an old Tony barrister named Richard Woodhouse, and Woodhouse was in bewildered awe of Keats's unequaled verses. Keats's work was often about classical themes, Endymion being a case in point. That's a reworking of an ancient Greek poem about a shepherd who has this spell cast on him, causing him to sleep for centuries. And his overture is very well known. So his verse is often of delightful simplicity, like fairy song. It's charmingly spare, lyrical, and it's almost infantile as a ditty goes. Shed no tear, oh, shed no tear. The flower will bloom another year. Overhead, look overhead, amongst the flowers, white and red. Weep no more. Oh, weep no more. The young bud sleeps in the root's white core. Dry your eyes. Oh, dry your eyes, for I was taught in paradise to ease the breast of melodies. The poem goes on to be a valediction and perhaps his perspective of his own impending demise when he writes, Adieu, adieu, I fly adieu, I vanish in the heavens blue, adieu, adieu. And indeed, he made his final adieu only, was it 3 years after that. So his verses are unfailingly blithe and splendiferous, and he was ever mindful, as poets seem not to be now, that the chief distinction between poesy and prose is that the former is made to be declaimed, whereas prose is usually read silently. So he composed some magnificent, challenging, and searching pieces. His resplendent odes are the ones which have really made his name, like Ode on a Grecian urn. Many regard that as his masterwork. And in this, he addresses the praise poem to an ancient artifact and lauds as being more expressive of past glories than anything a poet could write. Still thou unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals, or both, in Tempe or in dales of Arcady? So Arcadia meant to be a part of Greece, et in Arcadia ego. So these lines were whispered by a fatally ill 23-year-old. And when you regard them that way, you may catch their cadences. Bear in mind, he was writing in an epoch when ye, thee, and thou were still in common usage. So it's not as stilted as it may seem now. His verses were flawlessly constructed in terms of meter and rhyme, and there was never any strained word, though there were some half rhymes. I reckon that Ode to a Nightingale is his most stupendous accomplishment. In the first stanza, he writes, light winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. The reversal of the adjective noun order, there's a particularly literary word for that device. I can't recall it. It gets the attention of readers, but though this was not so unusual at the time, the accented E of winged is because it's metrical. Remember, a dryad is a living spirit of the trees in ancient Greek theogony. And in the second verse of the poem, it's surely the most splendidly evocative description of wine of all time. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song, and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker of the warm South, full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. So the work is packed with classical allusions, but he bears his erudition lightly, and these allusions were widely recognized at the time. His references to mythology were relatively few and not that abstruse for the era. He succeeded in putting into verse seemingly this inexpressible mental sensation of drinking alcohol, which I've done myself more than once. It was an inestimable privilege for me to stand under a tree outside his house in Hampstead where he wrote this poem. The tree that now stands there is probably a descendant of the original. So Keats was capable of composing a poem on a well-worn theme without being trite. He avoided weary cliche, and his use of imagery, as you'll see, was extraordinarily inventive. His poesy has verve and bounciness. Like in Ode to a Nightingale, he wrote, "Tender is the night," and that gave F. Scott Fitzgerald the title of his last novel. So later on in Ode to a Nightingale, Keats writes of how it's not worth living to a sorrowful or troublesome old age. The weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad, last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs. He composed that verse in May 1819. He was 23 and was already stricken with tuberculosis. He was ever more conscious of his coming death. He knew it couldn't be far off. That it was why it's worth persuading himself that living long was not to be sought after. He sputtered up blood, and then this redoubled his conviction that he should not waste his time trying to qualify as a doctor. Um, he put all his passion and his little remaining life into his poetical works. It would have taken another 3 years to be a doctor. He didn't have 3 years. He actually only had 2 years left to live. The fatally stricken poet wisely chose not to squander it on exams. Okay, he could never join that profession, and that's why towards the end of the of Ode to a Nightingale, as Adieu, Adieu, he was preparing to leave this mortal coil. Then in Ode to Sleep, he encapsulates his wonderment of slumber in lines which must be susurrated. O soft embalmer of the midnight still. There's a freshness and vitality to his verse which is never surpassed. And yeah, so he always shows exceptional insight. He's never hackneyed. The poesy of his verse doesn't meet universal, or didn't meet universal approval. Take the Irish Tory MP, indeed the guy who founded the Conservative Party, John Wilson Croker. He reviewed Keats's poems in the Quarterly Review, and Croker panned them as a jejune. He scorned the young poet as half-educated. He was contemptuously said him part of the Cockney School, a circle of poets who hadn't attended varsity. So perhaps that was just sheer snobbery. Anyway, Keats, he also composed light verse. The most unserious is this playful poem, A Song About Myself. There was a naughty boy was he. He would not stop at home, he would not quiet be. He took in his knapsack a book full of vowels and a shirt. So he followed his nose to the north, he followed his nose to the north. So it's a cheeky little poem showing he's capable of writing light pieces for children. Plain though it was, there's a certain sparkle to it. Now, he never married, he had no children, so it was the wains of others who were reared on a wholesome diet of Keats. He composed many more awe-striking lines, more than I can quote for you this evening, and they're too numerous to cite. And that's just a very small sample of his splendid work. He was incapable of mediocrity. Anyway, he always found an original angle. Um, He studied the established poets well, but he didn't imitate them. He'd found his own voice. So I think you'll concur. It was all fabulously evocative. His use of imagery and other equal literary devices, the lines enjambments succeed so splendidly. Um, Everything's just gorgeously enmeshed, and you may find your mind a swim in wonderment at this ineffable and peerless brilliancy. Is magnificently memorable, and there's a marvelous musicality which enchants me, is euphonious, felicitous. It is a rare delight. I care deeply not just for the signification of words, but for their sound. So if you read it, you may be entranced and even spellbound by these heavenly poems. Dull would be he of soul who could read this poesy and not find himself carried on the viewless wings of poesy, as Keats would say. So there's an audacity that pervades his poetry, and the lines may fill you with some unexampled rapture. So appreciate the lyricism and the unimprovable diction, and that accounts for his extraordinary popularity. So the complete works of Keats consist of only a few hundred lines. But what does it say on his headstone? Well, he didn't know he was going to have his literary apotheosis. This grave contains all that was mortal of a young English poet, who on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the maliciousness of his enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone: "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." 24th of February, 1821, and is adored with the image of a lyre, because Lyre, a musical instrument, because in Greece poems were declaimed to the accompaniment of a lyre, and his works were lyrical. Okay, so I think that's probably enough about Keats right now. Thank you for watching my video. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon, donate on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Goodbye.